So, the first audiobook I listened to was Red Shirts, and this is by John Scalzi. And if you can't tell by the title, this is a spoof on the old Star Trek kind of theory slash humor, whatever, around red shirts. If you wear a red shirt and you go on an away mission, you will die. And this kind of just plays around with that, tries to make it funny, and it does succeed for the most part. This is the first John Scalzi book I have listened to or read, and I will definitely be listening to more. They're nothing deep, but they are, a fun little break, and it's kind of funny to see, all the old Star Trek tropes and all thrown in there. And you get a few more serious moments, but then at the very end, it does get a little too meta for my personal tastes, where, it's like, well, wait, we were all the main characters in this show, so what are you? Oh, I'm the main character in something else. And obviously it's supposed to be the book, and that was just a little bit like, okay, we get it. You don't have to take it that far. But it was still relatively funny. And I did like the three codas in first, second, and third person, and you kind of get a little more of what happened with all the characters in the book, and that was pretty fun. So if you like kind of like a light sci-fi, something that kind of makes fun of the normal tropes of sci-fi, I could definitely recommend this. The audiobook wasn't bad, but the narrator definitely wasn't my favorite narrator. Some of the voices kind of blend it together. I've listened to a lot of audiobooks where the narrators are really good at creating a distinct voice for each character, but in this case there really wasn't. So it might be better to read it than to listen to it as an audiobook, especially if you don't really listen to audiobooks on a regular basis. And yeah, that's about all I have to say about Red Shirts. So I listened to Metatropolis, which is a shared world building sort of thing, and basically it imagines a future in these short novella length installments, each written by different authors, but they're all in the same world. They all have to kind of like build on each other. So we have In the Forest of the Nights by Jay Lake, and this one kind of starts out the world. We've had plenty of global warming, the collapse of the big businesses, and so this particular one, you have the hardcore greenies who want to basically make everything free, live off of the land, so on and so forth. And in that one, they are actually almost terrorists, and they are referred to as that several times. So that one was kind of an odd one. It was very interesting from the little bit of like tech that we got. How they stayed undetected while doing this stuff was pretty interesting. I did feel like it kind of drug a little bit, and it was definitely more of a character piece than anything. Then we had Stochastic City by Tobias S. Buchel, and The Red in the Sky Is Our Blood, which was by Elizabeth Bear. Both of those kind of go together. They're both about Detroit. Then in Stochastic City, that was more of like the start of it, and how you had the people who were protesting the use of like private automobiles not necessarily private automobiles, but like if only you drove it and you didn't give anybody else like a carpool or whatever. They wanted everybody to use bikes, public transport, and such. And this follows somebody who doesn't necessarily agree with that, but then he gets kind of sucked into their protest, and they use this protest to make a skyscraper into what they're calling a vertical farm, so they can grow all the food they need, like in this one skyscraper. And their dream is to basically have everybody live within 10 miles of everything they need. Which I kind of think that idea could work, but at the same time, I also feel like it would backfire a little, because what about like medical emergencies? You would literally have to have a hospital like a lot closer than that, which, I mean, I'm sure they would make exceptions for the ambulances, but that was something that wasn't explored that I thought maybe could have been. And then we have The Red in the Sky Is Our Blood. It kind of takes place after that, because they've taught, in that one, it is about this woman who lived, in Eastern Europe, and her husband had an affair, had his mistress killed, and then was going to kill the child that he had with the mistress, but instead she took the child and tried to keep her safe. And she mentions a lot of like the vertical farms and stuff, and how the protests that the previous story was centered on, how they had kind of become to this. And you get to see how kind of like the government and big companies react to it, and how they kind of like have their own private, not necessarily police forces, but like private security that can try to come after these people. So that was interesting. Now, John Scalzi's story, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. It is a Latin title, and it means we use everything but the squeal. And this is about a young man in a city that, it's St. Louis City. And it is kind of interesting, and again, you get to see the technology. These pigs have been genetically engineered, because basically they use the methane from their waste, and they use urea and other things from their waste as well, and they kind of use all of this to power the city in a greener way. And then these pigs are also a little smarter, so they kind of like know where the vents are to collect the waste and usually go there. But this kind of touches on, politicians' children, how they kind of can come off as arrogant, and how they may not necessarily try as hard as school. And then in this future, when you are 20, basically you go to school until you're 18, then you take a test that basically gives you a score that says what jobs you're fit for. Then you have an interview, and those interviewers can say, even though this person may not know a whole lot about this, they are willing to learn, they have an interest in it, so this might be a good job for them. And then you have to pick a job. And they basically take all the open jobs, you go in and you talk to like the job placement officer. They have all these jobs available on the board. Then, okay, let's plug in your scores. Plug in your scores for the second one. Okay, these are the jobs that are available for you. You have to pick one by the time you're 20. If you don't, you'll be kicked out of the city. And it just seems like a little too much control to me, but at the same time, they do have the choice that the next time these tests come around, which is, I think, they're once or twice a year, they can retake the test, and now if their scores get better, they can now get a different job, a better job. So there are, there's multiple choices usually. Like even this guy, he has 3 jobs to choose from. then somebody takes one of them, so now he has two. But he still has, if a limited choice, he does have a choice, so it's not as bad as it could be, but it still feels like a lot of restriction. Then the final one, which I found the most interesting, is To Hide from Farcelania, which is by Carl Schroeder. And this was the most interesting one to me. This takes the idea of, like, if you are of online nations. Basically, like, if you like to play World of Warcraft, for example, even though you might live in America, you're still part of the World of Warcraft nation. So you could also have a neighbor who's geographically in South America, in Africa, in Spain, in, Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, Australia, they could be anywhere. And it kind of takes this and shows how these people make their own economy, and they kind of operate outside of the real world economy. And it was very interesting. You have people who are ridden, so basically they have a VR set and their controller has a VR set, and this VR set will tell them that their controller wants them to raise their hand, wants them to blink or smile or smirk or whatever. So it's definitely interesting, and I would be interested in more on that. This is a trilogy. I have started Cascadia. That is the second one, and that kind of follows the first book, In the Forest of the Night. That is about Cascadia, which is in the Cascade Mountain Range, and it's part of the western coast of America, as well as it goes up into what was Canada. And so I'm definitely being interested to learn more about that. I feel like this second book is going more into depth, more of what we're missing from just this first short story. So if you like kind of like the future sci-fi, this is where tech could go, definitely check that one out. So I listened to the second short story collection in Metropolis, and this one is Cascadia. This one is set about 40 years in the future from the original Metropolis, and it brings back a lot of the same authors. It's opened again by Jay Lake, and this story of his is called The Bull Dancers, and of course it brings back in the lore of Tiger a little bit. This is more about Bashar and the CEO that was a big player in the original Jay Lake story. I thought this was pretty interesting. I do feel like we got some more information about the world building, and it was much more fast paced. Then we have a new author in Water to Wine, and this is set out in California on a winery and follows the story of this family and how different tech such as smart dust is affecting them, and follows the kind of political maneuvering around somebody trying to get their land, and just shows kind of how people don't change. And it does also bring in this new type of money that's called a wino. It's backed by the wine, and it does expire, so people can't really hoard it. Then we have Byways by Tobias S. Buchanel, and this echoes the themes of his original contribution, which is Schohaste City, and kind of how, Going Green continues. And I really like the descriptions in this one. I feel like the machines and the atmosphere, the setting was very well described. I could picture all of that a lot better than in his original. Then we have Confessor by Elizabeth Bear, and hers actually doesn't tie into Tobias Buchanel's this time. And it's rather interesting to see this is more of the genetic side. And a Pacific tree octopus makes an appearance. That's all I'm going to say about that one. It was interesting. Not necessarily my favorite, but it was interesting. Then we have Deodan by Carl Schrodinger. And again, as with the first book, I find his story the most interesting. It also has the most focus on tech, and it gives this idea of how a animal interface has been made to where, like, crows are able to go to this interface and basically make certain choices, I guess, between things, and then it can interpret it into a way humans can understand. Like, there's road work going on, and so they're agitated and stuff, and they're able to show that. And so there's a post made by the crows that say, we're not a fan of the road work. And this leads to a Goldman exoskeleton, which has been mentioned throughout these books, and some things with that. And it was really interesting, and I just really did like that story. Then the last one is A Symmetry of Serpents and Doves. This one had the least tech in it. It was very focused on religion, and that I did really like the hope that Mary represented, and the way that she said, I'm just going to keep doing this and eventually people will show up. And one other thing I did like about this is we had some Star Trek names narrating. We had LeVar Burton, we had Will Wheaton, we had Gates McFadden, and we had Kate Mulgrew. So I found that fun as well. I think if you like these kind of more tech-based sci-fi stories, more like near-future stories, definitely check out Metatropolis and Metatropolis Cascadia. So I just finished The Drowned Woods by Emily Lloyd Jones, and this is connected to her other novel that I read several years ago, which is The Bone Houses. It's set in the same kingdom, but it is set a little earlier, and it does have the fae, the fairies, however you want to say it, and I did enjoy it. It was kind of like a heist novel, and then you also had a very cute little corgi, and in Welsh legend, corgis were the mounts of fairies. So in this, of course, because fairies are, human-sized, corgis are their spies. But he was absolutely an adorable little doggy, and it was very fun to have him in the story. And I felt like the characters were all pretty well fleshed out. And overall, it was a good story. I was a little disappointed in the ending, and I'm not going to say much more than that because I don't want to spoil it. But I feel like this type of ending is a little bit of a cop-out for authors, and I've seen it used many times, and sometimes it's okay. Other times, like I said, it is just a plain cop-out. So, yeah, it's hit and miss with me, and this time was a miss for that type of ending. But I did kind of like how it did tie back into the Bone Houses at the end. And I can definitely recommend either this or the Bone Houses. Although I'd say if you only want to read one, read The Bone Houses first. I thought that one was a little bit better. I finished Wayward, which actually just came out this month, and it was pretty interesting. It is about 3 women who are all related, and it follows them in their lives and in their dealings with men and magic, basically. So you have Altha, who was born in the 1600s. She is put on trial for being a witch because one of her neighbors got trampled by his cows, and everybody says that she's a witch because part of the gift of this family is they can talk to animals, they can heal, and some things had happened, and some falling outs had happened, and this just kind of got exacerbated. And of course, being the 1600s, you had the whole Salem witch trials and the witch hysteria and all of that. Then it follows one of her ancestors who lived in between the wars, and her name was Violet. And it follows her dealings with her father, brother, and cousin. And of those, her brother is the only one I really like. Her father is... I'm not even going to go there. Same with her cousin. Then we have, at the very end, then we have 2019, Kate, who is Violet's great niece, Violet's brother's granddaughter, and she deals with some things in her youth that make her feel like she's not worthy of love, gets into an abusive relationship with a man named Simon, and then when she gets pregnant, she is able to kind of realize she is worthy of love, what happened was an accident, and grow as a person. And this was a pretty good book. It definitely explored the links between women, be that friends or family, and how women have been persecuted at times, and different things like that. And I thought it was pretty well written. It did take me a while to get through, because parts of it were really heavy, especially with Violet and the great niece. Like, those were very rough to read. At least Altha, she was not abused by a family member or anything. She was imprisoned, but she wasn't treated worse than prisoners of that time were. So I could kind of, that one didn't bother me as much. And I did like as well that you had first person past tense, third person past tense, and third person first tense. So it was kind of easy to keep track of which story you were in other than by just the names. I do recommend that if you like stories about women and the connection they have to each other and the land. Gallant is the first Victoria Schwab, V.E. Schwab book that I've read. I do definitely plan on reading more. Mostly A Darker Shade of Magic is what I wanted to read. But Gallant was interesting. It was definitely a darker book, and I feel like it focused a lot on the atmosphere versus fully developing the characters. None of the characters were bad, but they all just seemed to be kind of one-dimensional, or, kind of just stayed static, and they didn't seem to have a whole lot of development. But I did really like the concept, and I did really like, the descriptions and everything, and the plot was a really good plot. It was really interesting, and the idea of this whole shadow world was also, really interesting, and I felt like really well done, really well described. And I would say it's a good book for anybody who likes kind of like the darker stories. And yeah, I didn't have a whole lot to say about this, but if you check it out, I do hope you'll enjoy it.